Hello friends, thank you for joining me again as I continue on my journey of making Regency style historically accurate undergarments. So I have made the chemise, I have made the corset, and now I am moving on to a bodiced petticoat. If you recall, the very first piece that I made was a non-bodiced petticoat. It just had the straps, but now I'm going to attempt a bodiced petticoat. So when I perused the photographs out there, I love to look at the Met in particular. They have some really great photographs of historical clothing articles. I found two basic bodiced petticoats. There's not a lot of photos of extant petticoats out there from the Regency period, so those are the only two I was able to find. They were both different in style, and I ended up going with a particular one, and I'll explain that as I show you the picture. So I printed it because taking a picture or taking a video of it on my computer screen is a little bit hard for you to be able to see the actual picture. And even though my printer is only black and white, I feel like it's a little bit better representation. And these are from the Met photographs. So here's all three of the photographs they have of it. As you can see on the photograph, it has gathers across the top, gathers across the bottom. It has a little bitty waistband and then a flat skirt in the front. There are rows of pleats that run down the bottom, and then it actually looks like a version of our eyelet around the bottom, which would be embroidered, hand embroidered in their day. If you look at the back, the straps come in. You guys see the cut in of the armholes, which was very common in that period. That was one of the things that sets apart Regency style, is the way the armholes are cut. And then you can see it buttons down the back into the waistband, and then there is fullness on the back of this skirt. It is pleated toward the center on each side. And what's interesting is when you look at the close-up of the bodice, I noticed a couple things that I didn't notice before. So this is not gathered. It's actually got some sort of ribbon or cording in here to pull it up to fit, which is common for much of the clothing from that time period. You can see the cording over to this side that they used to gather this top edge. What I like about this petticoat is that it looks like you can mostly make it with squares and rectangles, okay? If I look at the top of the bodice, it looks like it's just a rectangular piece that they've gathered at the bottom and then pulled in at the top. If I look at the skirt, of course, it's two rectangles, maybe slightly slanted out at the sides with a slight A-line. Of course, the waistband is going to be one thin, long rectangle, and the straps come over and stitch into the top of the bodice front. So once again, here's another rectangle. If you look super close, the back, you can see the straps stitch in right here actually. They're not actually cut one with the fabric. So really the only piece that has much curve to it at all is this back bodice piece. It has a slight curve here at the neckline that's not created by slanting the straps over, and then the armhole curve. The front bodice has some curve here under the armhole as well, so the armholes will have to be drawn in. That was easier than drawing the other bodice, which was more fitted. If you look at the pictures, it does not have gathers running across here or here. It's flat in the front, and that's the other reason I like this one, is because it's adjustable for fitting. So that way, if I'm doing a photo shoot and someone else is modeling that's close to my size but not identical to my size, we can just put this petticoat on them, pull the neckline up to fit, and make it work for them as well. So that appealed to me as well. So that is why I have chosen this. So the next step, of course, is going to be drafting the pattern I will use to make this. Now, I'm going to use the same white muslin that I used for the chemise. As I mentioned before, it's slightly heavier than I would love, but I'm still waiting on my cotton gauze to arrive that I had ordered, and I want to keep working on making these undergarments while I have time. So I'm going to go ahead and make this one out of white muslin. Of course, if I love it or I want to make some slight changes to it, I can always make it in the cotton gauze later. Or if I don't like the way it hangs under certain dresses, I can make it in a different fabric later. I haven't mentioned this in my other videos, but One of the most common fabrics, it seems like, from the surviving garments that undergarments were made of is actually linen. I haven't used linen because it's much more expensive than buying cotton, so I go with cotton because it's our cheaper alternative now. However, from my research on it, it does sound like it's the most breathable and comfortable of the alternatives. There, of course, are some silk undergarments that survive as well, but that would be something that would be way more expensive. I'm just looking for something that will give the silhouette, that will keep, that will be against my body so that my body oils don't get on the actual clothing, and I feel like cotton will breathe well enough for my purpose. So that's why I've gone with cotton. I also tend to do things on a budget. Like if I can make it authentic, but not spend a whole lot of money on it, that's what I will tend to do. I prefer to do my costuming that way as opposed to spending a lot of money on something and getting it perfectly the most possible accurate, as opposed to getting something relatively accurate and spending less money on it. That's my preference. So I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're going to join me on this journey. The next step will be drafting the pattern. So I'm putting my paper to good work. I don't usually like printing these on paper because I don't like wasting the paper, but I decided to mark up all the measurements and figures and things that I noticed before I go to draft the pattern. So I took my measurements, once again using that same 9-inch measurement that I had taken for the chemise. That's about where I want the neckline of this petticoat to fall. Then I did from the top of there to just under my bust, so that's about 6.5 inches. And then I measured from just under my bust to my ankle. Now that's where the dress would fall. Your petticoat, you want it to be shorter than your dress. So usually my hems are close to 2 to 3 inches deep at least. So I would take probably about 3 inches off of the bottom of this. And then if I'm going to add the eyelet, I would take off the amount for the width of the eyelet as well. So if it's 1 inch wide eyelet, then I would take off 4 inches off the bottom and then just add my seams to that. So I've marked all of that. I noted things that I noticed, how the straps are narrower in the front than they are in the back. The width of the front, I'm going to make it the width of my front, of course, from side seam to side seam, plus 3 inches of ease. That's about what you need to achieve that kind of gathering right there. The waistband is super narrow, so I'm going to assume that it's about 1 inch wide finished. So of course I'm going to cut it 2 inches wide and use 1/2 inch seams like I like to do. The shoulder straps appear to be seamed only on one side. They appear to have been cut out, folded in half, and seamed on one side. Originally I was thinking about making them attached in right here instead of making them a separate piece, but that would put them on the bias. That would put this part of it most likely on the bias of the fabric, and I don't want my shoulder straps stretching. So instead of that, I think I am going to cut them separate and put them on the straight grain so that I'm not worried about them stretching. I noticed that there's only 2 buttons here, and that something I didn't notice before, there is a cording or a tape here at the waist to pull in the waist a little bit. So that means when I make my waistband, I'm going to add just a tiny bit of ease. Normally I would add at least 1 inch of ease just for breathing room and getting it on and off and being able to move while I have it on. I will probably add 2 inches of ease, so that way I have just a tad bit to pull up. Like you can see how there's a little bit, a tiny bit of gathering, a tiny bit of pulling up right here at the back center. So I noticed that. The pleats look to be about 1 inch deep, and there's 5 of them on each side. So that means I need to add 10 inches to the width of my back skirt. I also measured myself and went across here. So the front of myself across here would be 24 inches. My total measurement is 41. So then I would add the 3 inches of ease to cut out this front rectangle. And then at the bottom, I put my waist measurement without ease so that I have that to work off of. The pleats at the bottom also appear to be inch deep pleats. So and there also appears to be 5 of them there as well. So that means I would add 10 inches to the length of my skirt. So after I take off the amount for the eyelet and the amount I wanted above the hem, then I would add those 10 inches on and my seam allowances. So just to kind of take you through the thinking process, the only thing that's puzzling me on this petticoat is that the back waist appears to be lower than the front waist. And I don't know if that's an optical illusion because of the way that it's cut and the neckline on the back is cut so much higher. And perhaps it's just tricking my eyes, but it appears to be lower. I don't necessarily want my back waist lower, so I'm not going to try to replicate that. I'm going to make it straight across, but I just noticed that as I was analyzing these pictures. So from here, I can go into drafting the pattern. And what I'll do for this back bodice block is I'll start out by drafting a square for the measurements that I need, and then I'll go in and draw in my armholes and my shoulder slant and the very slight bit of neckline that's left right there. All right, so first step, I took my bodice front, my petticoat front, and I serged and hemmed the 1/2 inch down at the top of it, and I ran the drawstring in the casing. Of course, I know you're so surprised to know that I used lavender ribbon at this point. It's the same lavender ribbon I used on my corset. I love that color, and I always use it kind of as a little accent or a little pop wherever I can. So that's my first step. My second step, I took my shoulder straps, I folded them in half and did the 1/2 inch seam and then flipped them out. So you can see how they slant. My next step is actually going to be basting all the bodice pieces together. So I'm going to baste the back bodice to the straps and to the side seams of the front bodice, and then put the straps on the front of the front bodice. All of it's going to be basted because, as I mentioned before, I'm not 100% convinced that I have the slant correct right here. I also want to check the length of the straps. I cut them longer rather than shorter. So I'm thinking that if anything, I'll have to cut some off, but I want to check the length and make sure that that's correct as well. So I'm going to baste it all together and drape it on myself to see how it's fitting. All right, so here is the basted together bodice of the petticoat. I'm going to kind of pull this in so you can get an idea of what that'll look like when it's fan gathered there in the middle. As I suspected, the straps are slightly too long. I have them tentatively just pinned up right now because this will probably be one of the last things I actually attach. So I'll probably just leave them the way they are, pin about where I think I'm gonna have to cut them, and leave them long until the very end, just to make sure that I'm correct in cutting them once you get the weight of the skirt on there and things change a little bit. The armholes pull up really high, higher even than the corset armhole right here, and I can't really let the straps out to fix that because from what I understand from my research, your petticoat should come across the top, should cover the top of your corset. So if I drop those straps, then my petticoat comes below the line of my corset and messes up that. So I think I'm gonna do what I originally had talked about doing, which was going in and cutting armholes a little bit in the front. I like where I have these straps pinned. I did a good guessing job on that. So what I'm gonna do is just use that as a measure for where to start cutting down. Just go down about, I'm thinking maybe like a 1/2 inch, and then I'll use bias tape to just finish off that whole armhole all the way into the back. On the back, I'm actually pretty surprised at the slant. It actually looks good. It's not pulling or it's not gaping here like it has too much here. If it wasn't enough of a slant, it would be gaping and I would see easily that it was tight on that side and this side needed to be pulled in, but it's not doing that. So I'm very pleased with that. I would say otherwise, I'm very pleased. I understand now why the original looks like it dips down in the back, because quite frankly, it does when I put it on here. So I don't know if I'm gonna leave it that way or if I'm going to cut it up in the back so that it looks more even all the way around. I'll make that decision when I get to putting on the waistband and the skirt. I'm gonna go back and mess with my armholes and get them correct and finish off my armholes and my neck hole here and go ahead and fold over the back for the buttons and get that all ready. I won't put the buttons on until the very end. I do all of those steps, and then once I have all that finished, I will try it on again, decide if I want to cut this so that it cuts more up in the back and goes across more straight, or if I want to more copy the extant version where it seems to dip down in the back. All right, so I'm just sewing in my Regency under things because I'm going to be continually draping this on myself, and so I don't want to have to keep getting dressed in these. So I'm just going to sew for a little while on these until I get the bulk of this petticoat put together. So what I've done is I went in, I permanently attached the straps. So for me, that means stitch them with a regular stitch and then serge them and press them under. For my side seams, I serged them individually, stitch them together and press them open. I always do this in case I ever need to go back and take things in or let them out. It's much easier to take them in or let them out this way than if you just directly serge them, because then you only have a 1/4 inch seam, so there's no letting out going to happen. And if you serge them together, even after you've taken the seam, you have to pull them apart to let it out. So this way you just have to let one seam out. So I've done that. The other thing I did was for my buttons down the back, I put a 1-inch strip of iron-on interfacing, ironed it on, serged the edge, folded it under. So now that's ready for my buttons and my buttonholes when I get to the last step. My next step is going to be cutting my bias tape. So I will cut bias tape just like I showed you in the video on the Regency stays. And then I will run that along here to finish off the neckline. And then I will go into my armhole, as I talked about, and I will cut this lower. So I've marked where I'm going to start, and here I'm going to go down a 1/2 inch, cut in, and then come back up because it was too binding under my armhole. So then once I've done that, then I will take my bias tape, run it along this entire edge right here, from here all the way to here, and finish off my armholes that way. So those are my next 2 steps, is doing the bias tape to finish those things, and then I can move forward to gathering this bottom edge. I'm going to fan gather the bottom edge of the front bodice and attaching my waistband. Of course, before I do that, I'm going to have to decide, do I want to cut the back up shorter, or do I want it to dip down into my back kind of like the original does? So I still haven't made that decision like I mentioned. So once I get these bias tape bindings done, I will try it on again and decide what I want to do. All right, so I finished everything off with my binding. You can see my bias tape. All these edges are nicely finished off. I have the straps pinned in place from trying them on. When I tried it on, I did decide to go ahead and cut this up so that it's not so low on my back. I cut 1.5 inches off from this end and then just kind of curved it down to meet the side seam because I didn't want to cut any off of the front. I'm attaching the waistband now, so you want to leave a 1/2 inch out here, or whatever you made your seam size as, your seam allowance. And then what I do is I pin all the way up to the basting threads, and I do that on both sides. You can see I did on the other side too, and then I'll gather the basting threads to fit the remaining area on the waistband. I've marked the middle of the waistband so that I can match the middle of the bodice, which is easy to tell because that's where it ties, to the middle of the waistband. The way I decided where to start the gathering threads was by looking about where the gathering started at the top of the bodice. So I didn't want it to start on the outside of the strap. I wanted to start on the inside of the strap because if you look at the original picture, it is slightly narrower gathering on the bottom of the bodice than on the top. And so I moved it in just a little bit, the width of the strap, started there, and then ended there on the other side. So I'm going to gather that to the waistband, stitch that in place, and stitch the other waistband on the inside. So once I've gathered and stitched, then I'll take my other waistband and stitch it on the other side so that it flips out and the seam is fully encased. And then my next step will be to piece my skirt, pleat the back of it, and attach it. Alright, so the bodice is coming together. I just put on the waistband and gathered. As you can see, it really is too long. It really should end about right here. So I have about, let me get up a little closer so you can see. I have about 1 inch to play with right there, which means I can basically just cut this band off, regather, and re-seam. Actually, I have 1 inch. I need to cut a 1/2 inch off above the band, sorry, and then I still have a 1/2 inch left for a seam. The other thing is that when I curved that, it now dips in the side, so my back is much better, much more where I want it to sit, but now my side dips. So I'm gonna have to go back, straighten that across, and then cut that 1/2 inch off here on the front and reapply my waistband. So I'm gonna take a little break here, go eat some lunch, give myself a little time to think about this and make sure that this is how I want to do the next step. But it is slowly but surely coming together. I just need to remember, or I need to go back and mark on my pattern that I need to cut this slightly shorter because I cut it too long. But like I said before, it's better that it's slightly too long than too short because it's much easier to fix it and cut it off if it's too long than it is to re-put together a whole nother piece if it's too short. So our bodice is done, basically, except for the buttons, which we will do at the very end. I went ahead and attached the waistband on both sides, of course, so that that seam is completely encased. What I did on the ends, where the buttons will run, is I want to leave this open. So just fold it back when you do the final stitching. I'm going to fold these back so that the edge is finished, but that's going to be open. Because I'm going to run cotton twill tape through there, as I have in other petticoats, so that it is slightly adjustable if it needs to be pulled up. From looking at the original in the pictures, it does look like there is a tape that hangs out of there, so it looks like the original has some sort of tape to draw that waist up to fit. I could be overly ambitious and enclose the seam for the skirt, but I'm not going to, partly because I don't usually, unless it's like a super nice dress. Secondly, because this is just a petticoat. So I will, when I go to attach my skirt, I will just stitch through both layers at once and then just serge it off so that I have a nice seam finish. So my next step is I'm going to put together my skirt panels. I'm going to sew my side seams and pleat the back center of my skirt to attach it and finish off the back edges of my skirt so that I can attach all of that. Alright, so I showed this on the other Regency petticoat, but I wanted to show these steps again. So when you do the back center, you seam up the 1/2 inch seam all the way until about 10 inches from the top of the skirt, and then you just press the rest of that back, and I'm about to top stitch it. So then I'll just stitch, pivot, stitch across, pivot, and stitch up. And then that reinforces the seam down here, and of course holds that hem back. So that's how I finish those back edges for petticoats, because they don't have to necessarily overlap or have a lapel. They just need to at least meet because they're under clothing. So I just wanted to go over that step again. I'm going to do that, and then I will start doing my pleats across the top of the back and fitting it to my waistband that is already attached to my bodice. Okay, I'm not going to show you my face in this because I want you guys to be able to see the pleating on this petticoat. So it looks like from the picture it starts about 1 inch from the back. I'm going to start 1 inch from where I did that top stitching. So my first pleat will start 1 inch here. In addition, it's going to be 1 inch deep, so that's going to be 2 inches. And then I'm going to take it, fold it over 1 inch like this, and that's my first pleat. Okay, so because I ended up doing the deeper pleats, the 2 inch pleats. This tool that I'm using is called a hem gauge. You should be able to find them at Joann's or easily online. I'm pretty sure you could get one off of Amazon even. So then I'm going to repeat that process again. I'm going to do measure in 2 inches from the fold of that pleat, fold this over so that it comes to my 1 inch mark. Press it down, and then pin it in place. Now, all of these pleats face toward the back opening. If you look at the pictures, they all face toward the back opening. And I like to put 2 pins per pleat. So once I pin the next pleat, I put the second pin in for the first pleat. So you want them to all face toward the back. So I'm going to do the same thing again. 2 inches from the fold of that pleat. Fold this over 1 inch. Hold it in place, press it in place, and then pin it. And then I have to do that 2 more times. So Alright, that's my last one. So I have my 5 2-inch pleats pleated now for this back side. I'll repeat that for the other side. So I have the skirt attached to the waistband. I ended up only being able to leave in 4 of the pleats that I pleated because there wasn't enough room in the waistband. Somehow I miscalculated in between the front of this and the front of the skirt. I know the front of the skirt is wide enough for me because I already compared it to myself. So somehow the seam on this comes back just a little further than the side middle, and this didn't come back quite that far. So I have corrected that on the free downloadable pattern that you guys can access below so that you guys don't have the same mistake. But because it's a petticoat, once again, I'm not worried about the fact that these don't quite match up. It will still be very functional. It just doesn't look perfect. And it should still be full enough. Super excited about running my twill tape through here because that's what I will do, is run that through here. I just got it today in from tutu.com. That was the only place I could find to buy it. Once again, I'm still waiting to sew on my straps. I will do that actually as the very last thing once I've done the buttons and the hem and the pleats and everything else. So the next step I'm going to do is I am going to do the pleats on the bottom and do the eyelet. So I'm going to show you how to do the pleats first. Okay, I'm going to step you through the pleats. I'm not going to do the math and start with the top pleat. I'm going to start with the bottom pleat because mathematically that's easier. You might be wondering why they would have so many pleats on there. The reason is because if you have those extra layers of fabric, it adds stiffness to the petticoat, which makes it stand out away from your legs, and then in turn also makes the dress stand out away from your legs. And you see this as a trend that continues throughout the 19th century, ultimately ending in the crinoline during the 1850s. I shouldn't say ending, culminating in the crinoline in the 1850s. But in the Regency period, they started out with putting pleats in the bottom. Also, they started doing some cording in the dresses and eventually the petticoats. So when I look at the picture, that bottom pleat is not very far at all from the bottom. So I'm going to fold this up 2 inches. That's too much. I'm going to fold it up 2 inches. And then since it's a 1-inch deep pleat, when I take that 1-inch pleat, actually, I wanted to do a little bit more because I want to see a little bit of fabric. So that means I need to do more like 2.5 inches because, and this is why I work with it from the bottom, because mathematically I'm not the strongest, and so I would rather kind of do it hands-on and not just do the math. So take 1 inch, you're going to flip that, and then I'm going to have a little bit showing. Obviously, I'm going to have a little bit of a seam that pulls up for the eyelet, and then it'll look just about like it does in the picture. So 2.5 inches. I'm going to fold it up 2.5 inches. I'm going to go around the entire bottom of the petticoat and do this 2.5 inch fold up. Another thing you want to do is take it slow and easy because this is a curved skirt bottom. So you just have to kind of work with it, as you can see I'm doing, as you go around. Just kind of play with it. The top edge, when you press it, is not necessarily going to lay flat to the fabric because it's curved in A-line, it's going to have a little extra along this top edge compared to the bottom edge, which is fine. That's not going to be a problem once the pleats are in there and you attach the eyelet along the bottom. But just know that going in that that's normal when you're working with a A-line curved skirt like this. So once I've done that part, then I'm going to go to my machine and I'm going to stitch 1 inch away from this folded edge. So that's my next step, is I'm going to stitch 1 inch away from that folded edge. Okay, 2 tips that I forgot last time. Before you start the pleats, you want to put it on and make sure that it's about even all the way around when it's on you. There's not a place that's super long or super short. I checked it and it's fine. It's basically even all the way around. The other thing is when you stitch these pleats in, because of the way this skirt is an A-line, there's slightly more fabric on the lower you go on the skirt. So you want to put this side on the bottom, on your bobbin side, because that side tends to pull in a little bit more fabric because of the feed dog feet. And you want to stitch on the top of this side, and that way it will kind of pull it in and ease it in. And you can see right here, you'll see it almost like, you know, has a little bit of ease right there. And when you get to the front center middle, there's quite a bit. I couldn't even completely press it flat. There's a little bit right there. And I didn't have to run any ease threads. It just naturally did that because the feed dog tends to feed through a little bit more fabric than the top side does. So you're going to repeat that process until you get this the length you want. So in my case, I made it 10 inches longer than I wanted, so I'm going to do that 5 times. So what I'm going to do this next time is, now I need to decide how far do I want this from this pleat. Do I want there to be a gap between the edge of each pleat, just like there's a little bit of gap between that and the eyelet that would be attached? Or do I want them to be basically lined straight up on each other? Because if I want them lined right on each other where this one slightly overlaps, I'm literally just going to fold it over and do 2 inches. And that's what I think I want, is I want them to be just where the fold of this one just overlaps the stitching of that one, so that it's just this solid, so it's just this solid row of pleats. So I'm going to measure 2 inches from the row of stitching. So get my handy hem gauge again. Get it just perfect. There we go. And then I'm going to start my pressing. And I'm going to go around and press exactly the same way I did last time. And I will stitch exactly the same way. When I go to press them out after they're sewn, I press from the inside so that you make sure that this is going flat. And then of course press the pleats down. So those are several more tips that you can use as you're putting in your pleats at the bottom. We are nearing the end. I have 3 rows of pleats in. I'm going to continue putting in the other 2. However, I need a break from pleats because they just get very rote and boring after a while, but you can see that I have the 3 in. I need to finish the other 2 because if I don't, my petticoat will be too long for the dresses. Right now it hits close to the top of my ankle. I'm going to be putting on this 2.5 inch wide eyelet trim, vintage from the 70s. I bought an entire box of vintage trims from the 60s and 70s from a very kind lady on Marketplace. I got them for a steal. This one, the reason I'm choosing to use it on my petticoat is because even though I have OxyCleaned it, which is the best way to get whites whiter, it has little bitty, I don't know if you can see them, stubborn rust spots. I think at some point someone ran a pin through it to hold it and then it left rust spots and I cannot get them out, but that will not matter because it's my petticoat and they're not noticeable, so it will be fine and then it will look beautiful. The reason I'm going with eyelet is because very commonly in the Regency period they did white work, which is just basically white embroidery like this. This is obviously machine embroidery, so not as high quality of course as what they would have done during the Regency, but it is a good substitute because I'm not going to do this by myself. I'm not going to do all of this by hand, I should say. But I want something pretty to trim off the bottom of my petticoat. So in order to do that, if you notice, because of the way this is cut, it's got the scallops from the piece that was cut before it. I want to sew, or I want it to go straight along here. That's where my seam begins, at the bottom of those little U's. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my petticoat, the bottom, I'm going to put right sides together. I match the bottom edge of the petticoat with the bottom of that U. I leave a little bit overlapping here, and then once I've pinned it around the whole thing, then I'll go back and actually seam that part together. But I just pin it and then see exactly how it's going to be, because when you measure, there's always something variable that can happen, so I like just putting it right together. So I'll do that, I'll serge them together, then I will flip it out, press it out, and top stitch it up. So I'm going to do that next, finish my last 2 sets of pleats in the petticoat, and the bottom will be done. And then all I have left is buttons and buttonholes and running the tape through the waist. I was able to finish the entire bottom. I just haven't pressed out my last plate, but let me kind of flip it down so you can see what the finished looks like. So there's my 5 1-inch pleats. That top one will be pressed and look better, and then my eyelet running along the bottom. So that's the bottom, and when I tried it on, it kicks out really nicely, so it'll keep that space around my legs when I'm walking, so that the dress doesn't stick to my legs and get caught between my legs and all those things that long skirts tend to do. The other thing that I've done is I top stitched. I know that the picture of the original doesn't appear to have top stitching, but I went ahead and top stitched on each side. One, partly to hold this seam and folded up, and then two, just because I wanted to kind of narrow the area that the cotton twill tape will run through. So I've already run my safety pin on the end of this cotton twill tape. Once again, tutu.com is where I was finally able to find narrow cotton twill tape. I looked everywhere else and could not find it, so I finally found it on tutu.com. So then I'm just gonna stick it in my casing and do my normal method of running it through, and then I'll leave some tails that are about 8 to 10 inches long, knot them on the end, and then that way I can pull it up to fit my undervest exactly when I'm dressing. So, gonna finish running that in there. Gonna press out my pleats. Gonna put 2 buttons on the back here. If you look at the picture of the example, the picture of the original, they have 1 button right up here and then one kind of in the middle, and then I guess this twill tape at the waistline kind of serves as like the 3rd closure, and then you don't need any closure once you get into this part in the skirt. So I'm going to dig around in my button box, find 2 buttons, do my buttonholes, and then I will try it on one more time to determine that this is exactly where I want my straps, and press it, and it will be done. I have finished the petticoat, except for stitching on the straps. I just tried it on one more time with all the correct undergarments to make sure that I have the straps in the correct place. I ended up actually lengthening them slightly longer than they originally were when I first started working on the bodice. You can see the drawstring is pulled up just a little bit here at the waist. You can see where it ties and buttons in the back. And you cannot see the hem from this angle, but I will do another excerpt where you can see how well these pleats hold that hem away from your body and kind of kick it out. One of the things that I'm going to have to redo on the pattern, and I may go back and actually even do on this petticoat because it's not that hard to do, is I am concerned, I was right all along, I needed to slant that shoulder a little bit more. That's why it's gaping right here, because there's too much fabric right there. So it would need to be slightly slanted more in order to not gape. So it's an easy fix. I just have to pick out the bias tape just a little bit right there at the end, and then just take in a little bit, readjust that slant. So that's a fairly easy fix that I will probably do. I like the way the pleats fall on the back. I threw a dress over it really quick. I think it looks really good. I'm very pleased with the way it came out, actually. So I'm going to make those adjustments on the pattern so that the pattern that you guys download below is as accurate as possible. Alright, so as you can see, the finished petticoat is on the dress form behind me, and I have made all the changes that I learned about as I sewed this petticoat in the download that is accessible to you below, so you can click on the link if you would like a free downloadable pattern. It is drawn on graph paper, so then you just enlarge it to fit your measurements. And I have a video upcoming soon about how to enlarge patterns from graph paper if that's not something you are familiar with. But I am also sure that you can Google that and find other posts and videos about it by other people if you need help in figuring out how to enlarge from graph paper. The download also includes the step-by-step instructions, so everything that I've walked you through in this video is also in the download. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel or give this video a like, a thumbs up. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, so you can find me using the links below and follow me there to see what I'm currently doing. I do giveaways from time to time, and so if you follow me, you can get a chance at entering one of those giveaways. And then I also have an Etsy store where I make and sell Regency era dresses. So if you are looking for Regency era clothing, please go peruse my Etsy store using the link below and see if there's any designs you like. And if you are looking for a custom design that's not already in my store, please feel free to always send me a message. As always, if you have sewing questions or questions about this petticoat, please feel free to comment below. Thank you for watching and joining me on this journey.